Welcome to Bible Prayers and Untold Stories, where every whisper verse is truth, and every story brings light to the soul. Let us journey through the sacred words and uncover the wisdom hidden in prayer. There are events that are not recorded in history. There are meetings that are not broadcast in the media. There are conversations that do not leave a written record, but they move the soul of the church. On a quiet morning in the Vatican, between stone walls that have been soaked with centuries of prayer, Pope Leo XIV, who came from the lonely mountains of Peru, called a man who was not a politician, but shepherd of mercy, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. There was no media, no ceremony, just two people, two souls, and a breath from heaven. The conversation began not with orders, but with silence, not to assign tasks, but to listen, not to plan, but to listen together to the voice of God echoing from the deepest places of humanity. From that meeting, no one knows clearly what was said, but the world sensed that something sacred had begun, not by the sound of bells, but by the change in the eyes, the movement of awakening souls. In the windless corridors of the Vatican, where the sound of footsteps also became sacred, Pope Leo XIV sat there, alone, in a room that had witnessed secrets that had never been written down for ages. He held no scepter. He wore no resplendent robes. Just a father, with his hand resting lightly on his personal notebook, his eyes no longer reading, but turned toward the wooden door, discolored by time. That door, opened not by a schedule, but by a call from deeper than history. And then he arrived. No press, no escort, not a single step outside the protocol. Only Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, his deep eyes seeming to carry the cries of an entire nation, slowly walked through the doorway that was not open to the public. Tagle's footsteps echoed on the marble floor. The air was as thick as time had stood still. Two men, two very different paths. But now, in this moment, they stood before each other like two souls called back by the same one. There was no ceremony, no formal vestments, only a silent gaze, and a hand extended, not to hold, but to give. "Louis," the Pope said, his voice low and peaceful like the sound of running water in the middle of the night. "Your Holiness," Tagle bowed, but his eyes did not waver. In his voice was not the reverence of formality, but the trust forged by years of kneeling among men. The two sit at a small round table. No thrones, no golden statues, just two simple wooden chairs in the middle of a sacred space. And then the Cardinal utters 5 simple words. "I have come to listen." A seemingly ordinary sentence, but in the Pope's ears it is not just a word, but a signal, a response, as Samuel once said in the temple. "Here I am, Lord." No one recorded the conversation that day. No tape, no report. There's only the presence of God, dense, nameless, as if he were sitting there among them. Space is no longer a place. Time is no longer a flow. Everything becomes a sacred place, where the word is spoken not with a mouth, but with a silence that knows how to listen. From behind the backs of the Pope and Cardinal Tagle, sitting opposite each other, the light from the window fell on the table, creating a soft halo around the open notebook. No one really understood what had been said behind that door. No decree, no joint declaration, nothing clearly defined. And perhaps that was why it became all the more sacred, because in a world full of shouts for power, the two men chose to whisper. And instead of talking about power, they talk about the cross. Tagle's eyes, deep, wet, but not weak, a gaze that had witnessed the suffering of the nameless. No one won. No one needed to lose. For this is not a political game, but a call from God to those who dare to carry the cross of others upon their shoulders. They did not meet as two candidates for a throne, but as two companions on the dusty and bloody path of the Church's history. One had lived with the poor in Peru. The other had knelt to wash the feet of the abandoned souls in Cavita. There was no distance between them, only empathy, distilled from years of silent service. Pope Leo's hand rested lightly on the table, His hand trembled slightly, but not from weakness, but from carrying the weight of millions of souls. The church needs more than leaders. The church needs people who are empathetic. And in that room, they did not strategize. They opened their hearts to each other to show each other the wounds that power could not heal. The background music changes to a soft string melody, echoing like the wind through an empty chapel. And when the conversation ends, no one stands up victorious. Only one, the man, Cardinal Tagle, stepped out with eyes brighter than when he entered, and no one asked, but everyone felt he had been given a flame. Not bright, not burning, just a silent light, but enough to kindle hope in places where the darkness was too thick. Tagle walked through the Vatican corridors, the light slanting down on him. A few pilgrims recognized him and bowed their heads silently. One asked, "Your Eminence, what happened inside?" He smiled without pausing. His eyes seemed still fixed on the sacred room, and he only said, "We listened to each other." Just 5 words. No more, but like a prophecy of the times, where the world is too used to talking, and too few people know how to listen. And from that day, there were hearts, communities, priests, single mothers, who began to listen again. Listen with the heart, listening with tears, listening with presence. The flickering candlelight in a small chapel in Africa. A young monk repeats that sentence to the congregation in a trembling voice. We listen to each other. No one is born to be pope. No one grows up with the title of cardinal engraved on his forehead. But there are souls, forged not by thrones, but by the flickering candlelight in poor houses, by the callous hands of a mother and the silent eyes of a father who never misses a Sunday Massachusetts. A barren field in the mountains of Peru. A young man in a gray vestment, holding a small tin box. Leo, the young priest, walks through the mud to the dilapidated house where the dying are. Before becoming Leo XIV, he was just a young priest, barefoot in the red Andean dust, bringing the Eucharist to each tin-roof house. No church, no bells. There was only a small tin can, and faith was like the last breath of those who were about to leave. He did not preach with words, but with a silent presence, and with a bow when he heard the name of a child who had just died of hunger. The narrow alleys of Cavite, Philippines, muddy, tangled with electric wires. A man in a white cassock washed the feet of a drug addict, then sat under a tree to hear confession. And he, Luis Antonio Tagle, did not grow up in a hall, but in the corridors of the slums, where children learn to pray from their mother's voices, not from catechisms. He once said, "I learned to love God not in the lecture hall, but from the way my father nodded to every beggar who passed by our house." The church has had its crowned saints, but today, God calls forth 2 souls, not because they are distinguished, but because they know how to touch pain without making it visible. Climbing up a hill of poverty to celebrate Massachusetts, Tagle stood on a pulpit in Rome, weeping as he preached the Eucharist to thousands of anonymous people. One carried the Eucharist over the Rocky Mountain. The other heard confessions in a public park. Both wore vestments, but that vestment was not sewn from silk, but woven from tears, sweat, and cheap bread in his mother's kitchen. A boy, Leo, silently watched his mother recite her rosary in the small kitchen amid the sound of rising bread. A boy, Tagle, sat in a simple chapel, his eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight, and asked, "Why does God cry?" From innocent questions grew up shepherds who knew how to kneel before the pain of others. From poor kitchens burned flames that did not seek the throne, but sought the depths of mercy. From behind, Tagle and Leo, when they were both young, bowed their heads in prayer in 2 different worlds. But the light from each person's candle shone in the same direction, toward the cross. They were not born to rule. They were called to be present, to carry the cross with those who no longer had the strength to carry it. And now these 2 journeys meet, not to shine, but to burn silently like the last candle in a dark mass. The night scene at the Vatican. St. Peter's Square is empty. A figure walks slowly between the Bernini columns, not to be seen, but to hear more clearly the sound of the wind blowing through the ancient stones. That day's event, there was no newspaper headline, no special news, just a brief line from a Holy See press office. The Holy Father received Cardinal Luis Antonio G. Tagle in a private audience. No pictures, no comments, no smiles and handshakes in front of the cameras. And that very absence is the most powerful voice. The Vatican corridor, where the cardinals pass silently, whispering like the wind through their vestments. The secretaries, the monks, the guards, everyone hears, but no one knows. They don't say it out loud. They just look at each other. They nod, then silence, because there is no need to declare. The Church does not always speak. Sometimes silence itself is a form of revelation. What do they say? No one knows, but something has moved. Young priests in a diocese in Asia are praying at night. One whispers, "We don't need to know the details. We just need to learn to listen again." No one saw Tagle shed tears, but everyone realized that he had touched on something very deep, very real, and very difficult to share. He did not preach, no argument, just smiled and said, "We listened to each other." There were no orders, no rigid instructions, no resolutions, but a quiet wave was spreading from the Vatican to every small house. People began to pray differently. They spoke less, listened more. Even parish meetings, which used to end with an agenda, now end with a moment of silence to remember those who have been forgotten. Pope Leo entered the small chapel unaccompanied. He knelt for a long time, saying nothing, not by power, but by love lived in silence. Leo is changing the Church, not in writing, but in unseen actions, asking about a small diocese, calling out the name of a forgotten community, sitting for hours with an aging altar boy. "If the poor have to knock twice," he said, "then perhaps we have not listened enough." A group of children in Nigeria sing a hymn that Tagle once sang at a riverside service. A girl says innocently, "They are not kings, but they make us see God among ordinary people." Not a revolution, not a grandiose change, just a gentle movement of the Spirit, like a breeze through the dome of a church. And from the silence, the Church begins to move, morning light in a quiet field. Image of Pope Leo XIV listening to a child tell a story in a small parish. The scene is simple, the soft sunlight gilding his face. No one would have thought that a meeting without a declaration, a look without a live broadcast, a sentence without a signed decree, could start a revolution. But it is not a revolution, as the world calls it. No flags, no speeches, no impositions, just a change in a way of loving. Cardinal Tagle is walking in a poor neighborhood in Manila. People call him by his name, Padre Luis. He does not preach. He just bows his head, touches hands, listens to each person. He does not need a position. He does not wait for a movement. And he does not oppose anything. He just slows down to hear the smallest groan in the darkest corner of life. The world does not need more planners, Pope Leo once said, but people who know how to go where love is forgotten. Tagle responded in a private prayer. Then perhaps the Church needs to slow down to hear the voices of the prophets who are among us. The Vatican walls have not changed, but the light in the meetings has changed. Bishops talk longer. Young religious talk more about presence than about projects. In the diocese, someone begins to ask, who is the one who loves silently but is not seen? And so, not by pressure, but by light that seeps through the cracks in the door, a new church has begun to move, not by reforming canon law, but by sitting beside the suffering without explanation, not by power, but by a deeper power, mercy. Far-flung communities, from Haiti, Nigeria, to villages in Vietnam, have the same image, a priest sitting and listening, a nun singing a lullaby to the dying. A group of young people are learning to listen with their hearts. No one needs to convince, because they have seen. No one needs to order, because they have begun to love. This revolution is not happening in a basilica, but in a simple meal in the eyes of a disabled person, in a moment of silence after Mass, when a priest sits down to listen to an old man tell his story. Pope Leo and Cardinal Tagle sit together in the Vatican gardens. No meeting, no recording, no camera. A dove flies across the frame. Both are silent, but the light on their faces shows they understand each other completely. They are not rewriting doctrine. They are rewriting our imagination of leadership. That leadership does not need to speak loudly, but to sit lower, closer to the dust and tears. And where these two men meet, it is not to start a dynasty. It is to give the church something more precious than any power force. An example of living love. Candles flicker in thousands of chapels around the world. A little girl in Ireland holds up a picture she drew of Jesus, washing the feet of a man who was screaming. She writes, "He listened even when the world was too loud." And if the world today still yearns for a revolution, let it begin with silence. Let it begin with love that does not need applause.